right, maybe we'll get started. So my name is 𝘚𝘦𝘯𝘵𝘪𝘮, and I'm the Executive Director of the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies. The Fairbanks Center is pleased to be co-hosting together with the Asia Center this evening's talk about Sentimental Republic, the newly published book by Hang Tu, who is an assistant professor of Chinese studies at the National University of Singapore. And we are especially delighted to have helped support the publication of this fascinating book. The book's about how the four major intellectual groups in contemporary China, the liberals, the left, the cultural conservatives, and the nationalists, have debated Mao's revolutionary legacy. Tonight's talk will be followed by a discussion with David Wang, the Edward C. Henderson Professor of Chinese Literature in the Department of East Asian Languages and Civilizations at Harvard University. The talk will be recorded and it will be posted on YouTube and the Fairbanks Center's blog. So without further ado, let me hand the mic over to Professor Wang, and thank you so much this evening.
Thank you very much, Dinda. This is really a great opportunity for me to be part of this conversation with Professor Tu Hang about his new book, Sentimental Republic. I think we have 1 hour here for our conversation, and hopefully we'll save the last 10 minutes for questions and answers with our audience online. Our plan for today is like this. First, I would like to introduce Professor Tu Hang to say a few words about the book. The theme, the structure, or the goals he would like to accomplish, and followed by our conversation, things that concerned either myself or probably on behalf of the general audience. I'll raise some questions regarding the scope, the rationale, and hopefully some questions that probably will further engage us in our further discussion. So without further ado, probably we'll invite Professor Tu Hang to give us a general introduction to his new book. So here, Tu Hang.
Thank you, Dinda and Professor Wang, for your kind introduction. And I especially want to thank Professor Wang for hosting this dialogue. And also I want to thank everybody for being here virtually during such a busy time in semester. So I'm truly grateful for your time, and I look forward to your comments and feedback. I'm excited to share with you my new book, Sentimental Republic, which explores the dynamic of intellectual debate in contemporary China, or more specifically in the post-Mao period. So as we know that China's market transition since 1978 wasn't just a breakaway from Mao's revolutionary utopia. Instead, the reform period as we know it saw an outpouring of intense, often emotional discussions about the right and wrongs of Mao's utopian experimentations. So Chinese writers and scholars during this period, they grappled with the country's troubled past, reflecting on critical issues and catastrophic political events such as the Great Leap Forward movement, the anti-rightist campaign, and of course, there's the Cultural Revolution casting a long shadow over the post-Mao intellectual life. So in this book, I examine how Chinese intellectuals have debated Mao's revolution from the late 70s to the 21st century. And I look at how these discussions weren't just about political argumentations or rational deliberations, but were also deeply shaped by powerful emotions and moral sentiments. So that being said, my book is guided by two broad sets of questions, and one methodological, the other one more of historical and contextual based. So the first is about the question of approach, or the question of method. I mean, how does emotion shape the landscape of public intellectual debate? So that is especially the case because when we think about intellectual history, or think about the discipline of the history of ideas, we often imagine a story of abstract concepts, of abstract philosophies and ideological worldviews guided particularly by reason or by rational argumentation. But I want to pose this question: is there a place for emotion, or broadly speaking, for affect, for feeling and for moral sentiments in supposedly rational intellectual debate and political thinking? And can emotion influence the way ideas, those political ideas, those high-flown isms are formed, circulated, and contested? So that methodological concern then naturally leads to my second set of questions, which explore the relationship between emotion and ideas, or affect and memory in the post-Mao context. So specifically, this contextual question points to why were Chinese intellectual debates about the Maoist past so polarized during the reform period for the past 30 years or 40 years or so. And often you see it fueled by strong emotions and deep moral convictions. And how have certain feelings, such as guilt, such as the sense of shame, such as melancholy, such as anger and resentment, how did those feelings shape the different perceptions of the revolutionary legacy, of the revolutionary memory? So by bringing these two sets of questions together, my book aims to show that intellectual history, or history of ideas, is not just a history of abstract notions or concepts or philosophies, but also a history of feelings, a history that considers how emotions influence public debate and shape political memory. And so to better ground these questions, first I would like to give you a brief overview of the post-Mao intellectual and cultural dynamics. We know that ever since the end of the Cultural Revolution in 1976, how to deal with Mao's revolutionary legacy, especially his last enormous and catastrophic Cultural Revolution, has been one of the most central concerns of the post-Mao intellectual generation. So we can see that the reform period saw the emergence of liberal, left, conservative, and nationalist intellectuals who actively participated in sometimes really acrimonious, sometimes bitter, and factionalized struggles about the meaning of the past. So this began in the early 1980s with the New Enlightenment movement, with the 新启蒙运动, when you have many reform-minded intellectuals and writers called for an end to ultra-leftist politics and pushed for culture and liberal and political liberalization. But then things began to change a little bit beginning in the early 1990s with the end of the Cold War, and there was this conservative backlash in governance beginning in the early 1990s. So we see that the initial intellectual consensus on liberal reform began to splinter, they began to fracture. And then you have the crystallization of different ideological factions. You have the neoliberals, you have the new left, you have the Confucian revivalists, and you have popular nationalists, all eager, all beginning to take divergent positions on the direction of China's market transition, as well as the country's troubled past. So we can see that throughout the major intellectual debates of the 1980s and 90s, we can see that the underlying issue at stake was this sort of starkly opposing or even diametrically opposed views on Mao's legacy, which have fueled political and ideological divisions. So for the liberal intellectuals, for them, the revolution is seen as a series of totalitarian crimes. And they argue that the failure to fully purge this dark legacy will incur what they see as the return of the repressed. So from this perspective, China in the reform period must resolutely bid farewell to revolution and move forward toward the direction of global capitalism. And in the meantime, you have left-leaning intellectuals and writers who argue that despite the human cost of revolution, the utopian promise of Maoism, so we can think of certain Maoist ideals, such as socialist egalitarianism and the idea of mass democracy. So those ideals, even it led to catastrophic historical outcomes, the ideational significance of Maoism still speaks to us in certain ways. And so neo-left believe that these ideas can inspire alternative models to this Anglo-American version of neoliberal global order. And thirdly, we have cultural conservatives who have grown weary, who have grown really tired of this endless revolution versus enlightenment dichotomy. And so they propose to jump out of the modern horizon once and for all, and by returning to China's civilizational ancient past, such as the legacy of Confucianism. And lastly, For the advocates of popular nationalism, Mao's revolution was viewed as a muscular, as a kind of really strong response to China's so-called a century of humiliations. So for these grassroots intellectuals, what's important is that behind Mao's rhetoric of Marxist revolution or his discourse about proletarian internationalism, there was always a fervent desire for the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. So in short, for nationalists, nation comes before revolution. So in this regard, how should we account for these really polarized reactions and political divisions to China's revolutionary legacy? So first and foremost, I need to point out that my analysis has been enriched by intellectual historians who would like to argue that ideological polarization arises from the clashes between different political values and moral ideas, such as this tension between individual liberty versus social equality that have believed to be structured this big debate between the liberals and the new left in the early 1990s. So all these explanations point to what I call a rationalist and normative approach, which takes the position, which assumes that political identification results from rational cognitive thinking. So in other words, one becomes a liberal because they identify with the abstract metaphysical principles of liberalism from John Locke to John Rawls, or in the Chinese context, from 胡适 to 林昭, or from 胡适 to 陈寅恪. So that's the contribution of intellectual historians that I try to engage in my book. But as a literary scholar, I would argue that thinking has always been in connection with affect, with memory, and with moral feelings. So to use a metaphor or to use an allegory here, we can imagine the discursive realm, or this kind of intellectual battlefield that we have just mentioned, as an iceberg, right? The visible tip, the visible top represents the high realm of ideas with all values, ideologies, and worldviews they confront, they battling with each other. But I would say that beneath the surface lies something just as crucial, just as important. You have, in other words, a life world shaped by collective memory, shaped by structural feelings, and shaped by the lived experiences of high socialism. So these deeper currents, I argue, were also vital sources of intellectual discourse in the post-Mao era. So it wasn't just about abstract principles. It was about how intellectuals, how common people felt, how they remembered, how they made sense of their lively experience of the high Maoist years. So to understand post-Mao ideological polarization, to take an alternative explanation, I propose to examine what I call affective ideas, ways in which the formation of political ideas, all these kind of isms are bound up with quirky memories, volatile emotions, and moral sentiments. I mean, for those liberal intellectuals who suffered physically and especially mentally from persecution and exile for the past 30 years, their call to 告别革命, their fervent call to bid farewell to revolution was, of course, intermingled or saturated with painful personal memories and trials. And you can see that speaking of the Cultural Revolution, many survivors would immediately think through the anguished memories of persecution, such as the horrors of Red Guard violence and so on and so forth. And by contrast, for those writers and intellectuals who deliberately chose to remember their formative years growing up in the heat of Mao's revolutionary romanticism, and they feel nostalgic about the good old days of socialism. So you can see that these memories were effective. They grounded in lived experiences that carried emotional weight. And most importantly, I'm particularly attentive to how they formed the ground of political judgment and pushed individuals to go left or turn right in the post-Mao ideological space. So while I do not have time to go into details here, but I just would like to quickly give you a sampling of the cases that I try to deal with in my book. So the pathos of liberalism. So post-Mao Chinese liberalism, I argue, was charged with an imaginary nostalgia for Republican China, with 民国 And how do we understand this liberal pathos reflected in the so-called Republican era craze or Republican era fever, 民国热? I suggest that one powerful example is the legacy of Professor �𝘦𝘯𝘭 or Professor �𝘦𝘯𝑭 from Zhongshan University, who was widely regarded as one of the most erudite, one of the most important Sui-Tang historians in 20th century China. So Professor �𝘦𝘯𝑭 died a tragic death during the Cultural Revolution. According to various accounts, at the height of the Red Guards movement, there were many student radicals allegedly set up a loudspeaker outside his house and broadcasted revolutionary messages, Mao's messages day and night, eventually driving poor Professor Chen to the brinks of collapse. And this is just one of many, many tragic tales about how liberal intellectuals, or even sometimes apolitical scholars who refuse to participate in political events, like Chen, who suffered under Mao's mass campaigns. So in this chapter, I focus on the pathos, really the feelings of grief, sadness, and hidden anger sometimes conjured up by Professor 𝘚𝘦𝘯𝑭's death. So I wrote about how liberal intellectuals, they really try to dramatize 𝘚𝘦𝘯𝑭's tragedy. They try to retell the story in a melodramatic manner, in a tear-jerking manner, to express their hidden anger, to express their moral indignation against the ultra-leftist politics of their time. So for example, we have Professor 𝘊𝘩𝘪𝘯𝘵, who argued that 𝘚𝘦𝘯𝑭's heroic defiance was an extraordinary outcry of cultural loyalism, of 文化移民, at its most intense. And cultural loyalism itself could be dated back to the loyalist movement during the Ming-Qing transition. So Professor 𝘊𝘩𝘪𝘯𝑭 was making that imaginary linkage there by linking Professor 𝘚𝘦𝘯𝑭's liberalism back to Ming-Qing transition. And then beginning in the 1990s, we have a series of public discourse in the 1990s that eulogized 𝘚𝘦𝘯𝑭 as the last intellectual, as the master of national learning, and of course, as the one to whom Chinese culture has entrusted its fates, 中国文化托命之人. And I would say that it is important to know that 𝘚𝘦𝘯𝑭 himself, if you look at his scholarship carefully, himself was by no means a liberal scholar. I mean, he was a traditionalist at most, if not a cultural conservative. So we need to ask why liberal scholars actively participated in imagining, in constructing, in marketing, or even in branding 𝘚𝘦𝘯𝑭 as a defiant icon of liberalism, as a defiant icon of freedom. I want to propose that it was precisely these tear-jerking stories about 𝘚𝘦𝘯𝑭's life and death that enchanted Chinese liberalism with emotional energy and moral appeal. And we can see that from this particular case, 𝘚𝘦𝘯𝑭 fever, and by extension, 民国热, Republican era fever, was not just about antiquarian nostalgia for a bygone era. It was always about a politics of mourning and how to channel grief into a moral critique of Maoist politics. On the other hand, let's not forget that the post-Mao generation, and especially many Sinophone intellectuals, grew up in the heat of the Cultural Revolution. And so for the children of Mao, the crash of Red Utopia was the crash of something very personal, innocent, and full of hope. Something I think that marked their childhood and marked their youthful idealism. So how could you completely negate your own past? So the key term that I'm trying to do here in this chapter is left-wing melancholia, 左翼的忧郁症, an awareness of the collapse of Maoist utopia that engendered a poignant feeling. Namely that socialism was aged and burdened with its own past and therefore overwhelmed with melancholia. So here I would like to invoke Russian studies scholar Alexei Yurchak's phrase, which I think really captures, really trying to signify this kind of post-revolutionary melancholy in the 1980s. So everything was forever until it was no more. You can imagine that for the Red Guard generation, Maoism appeared to be sacred and eternal during their formative years, but it just crumbled, it just disappeared overnight over the course of reform. So that temporal experience, that shocking sense of disillusionment can be found in many intellectual reflections in the post-Mao period. So you'll find a generation of writers, of intellectuals and film directors wrestling with the question of left-wing melancholia. So in their cinematic representations, in their literary account, and in their cultural reflections, they repeatedly pose these questions such as, now we have this solemn awareness of the human cost of revolution. We have this triumphant end of history narrative claiming that there is no alternative outside of liberal capitalism. How do we come to terms with the bygone era of revolution and utopianism? So that's the question I try to wrestle with in my chapter about left-wing melancholia. And then don't forget, there is this rise of popular nationalism, especially this palpable resentment against the West, beginning in the 1990s, beginning in the post-Tiananmen era. So this patriotic feeling, we can see, was based on a drastically different historical narrative, a narrative of China's so-called a century of humiliation. So in this last chapter, I dive into popular nationalism by taking a closer look at this book called China Can Say No, 中国可以说不. So this book was a national bestseller, or perhaps the bestseller from 1996, written at that time by 5 angry young men, or if you prefer to call them populist intellectuals at the time. And we have to remember that the timing was just right. The timing was just too crucial. So the book was released, the book was published at the height of the Third Taiwan Strait crisis, when China and the US were even on the verge of war over Taiwan's pro-independence election result. So the book as a whole was essentially a sort of manifesto, a sort of really a crudely made emotional outpouring on China's foreign policy toward the US. So these authors was trying to give advice about China's grand strategy. But as we can see that unlike those really fancy and artsy and sophisticated arguments you see today defending the so-called China model, and you have all sorts of beautiful philosophical discourse about all under heaven or Confucian meritocracy or whatever, the grand strategy back then, back to 1996, was very simple, if not simple-minded. So these also argue that China must resolutely say no to the unjust demands imposed by those foreign devils. And that's it. I mean, just say no, no reason, no nuance, no negotiation, no art of the deal. Or it's just a kind of Trump style, knee-jerky no or undisguised hatred to anything we don't like. But then, and yet, the book sold over 2 million copies. Now I'm invoking those numbers because I am really jealous as an academic author whose aim is to sell 200 copies. And even this book led to a surge of copycat sequels. You can see it from the picture in the middle. So you have all kinds of copycat sequels, such as How China Can Say No, Why China Can Say No, and China Can Still Say No. Now we really want to ask ourselves why this really crude-made, really amateurish book became such a sensational hit and created a say no farce in the public media. So in this chapter, I propose that this is what Nietzsche calls the psychology of resentment or resentment. So whenever you are the underdog, you are the underprivileged people, you are in a weaker position, you feel humiliated. And especially when you feel jealous, when you are jealous of the power of the strong, you must pretend to be tough. You must stand up or wage, in Nietzsche's term, a slave revolt in morality. You must justify your moral values and assert yourself at any cost. Because if you do not stand up, you will be crushed psychologically by your stronger enemy. And I feel like apparently the Say No authors felt that China had been bullied by the West for too long, for over the past century. So it was time to flex some muscles, at least rhetorically, to show the Americans the moral indignation of the Chinese people. And we can see that how this feeling of unjust, this kind of wounded national pride played a key role, played a central role in the emergence of post-Mao Chinese nationalism. And in this section, I particularly want to highlight the manufactured, the artificial nature of nationalist sentiment. I mean, unlike previous discussions on liberal pathos or leftist or left-wing melancholy, where emotions, I think, often carry a certain sense of authenticity or a certain genuineness with less overt manipulation, we can see that those liberal intellectuals, they really emphasize, they really identify with Professor Chen Yingxue, or writers of left-wing melancholy, they really feel melancholic about the passing of high socialism. But I would argue that nationalism operates differently. Here, I think it is crucial to examine how different agents, how different actors, from grassroots intellectuals like the Say No authors to state agents, those propaganda officials, how those different actors mobilize negative affect to strengthen their different political claims. And I think this is what the sociologist Ari Hochschild refers to as the emotional truth of the populist narrative. So in that book, she describes it as a deep story that's not necessarily literally true, but feels as if it is true. I mean, the story appears to be true. The story sounds like true. The story feels true. Well, the claim about a century of humiliation, the claim about 百年国耻, or the idea of a deep state in Washington may be a fiction, but it resonates deeply with the emotions of those who felt marginalized or feel excluded by the power elite. As we can see that it is a narrative that doesn't demand deep understanding, but plays to the hidden anger, hidden grievances of the underprivileged, and offering them a sense of agency in a globalized world that feels increasingly alienating. So to quickly conclude my discussion here, the key takeaway here is that ideological debates in the post-Mao era have been deeply intertwined with affect, memory, and moral emotions. The clash of ideology, as we have discussed here, is never just the clash of values and ideas. It's also underpinned by all sorts of conflicting, quirky, ambiguous, fluid emotions and private memories. And so to understand why Chinese intellectuals and ourselves remain so deeply divided over Mao's revolutionary legacy, we have to look beyond the rational argumentations and examine the emotional undercurrents, whether it's pathos, whether it's nostalgia, whether it's melancholia, all sorts of different feelings that shape and inform intellectual thinking of the post-Mao period. So these are the broader questions that I try to explore in my project. And if you want to get the full picture, well, I encourage you to buy my book. Thank you. That's my very quick presentation. Let me stop sharing my slide here.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much, Professor Tu Hang, for your very compelling introduction to some of the highlights of this book. This is an amazing book. It's a rich book, and you have touched upon only selected aspects of your argument. I think some of our audience probably will be genuinely interested in your argument and would like to read more. For me, however, in rereading the introduction part of the book, I sort of noticed two strains in terms of your argument about this emotion politics, as you term. On the one hand, you refer to emotion, feeling, passion, sentiment, and to a certain extent, affect. And on the other hand, you talked about the kind of the dialectic relations between emotion and the intellect, right? So I think my first question for you is, how do you differentiate this book from the current discourse of the so-called affect studies, which have drawn much attention in academia, both here and overseas? So how do you think your book can contribute to not just merely emotion studies or emotion politics, but on the other hand, how would you say your book has contributed to our sort of renewed understanding of affect studies?
Thank you, Professor Wang. That's really a great and also difficult to answer kind of question. I think I would share a few thoughts on how I engage with affect theory in my book. I mean, these days when people, especially when literary scholars, think about affect theory, it's often associated with this postmodern or, if you will, Deleuzean idea, Deleuzean notion of affect as something that is pre-conscious, bodily intensity, this kind of impersonal, autonomous force that circulates before it can be named or be captured. And I think that there is a particular political dimension to this Deleuzean notion of affect. I mean, Deleuze has this idea, or even other postmodernists of his generation has this idea that we don't fully know what we think we are doing, that reason doesn't necessarily dominate our action, right? But I would say that that's not actually the direction that I'm trying to take in my book. I'm not looking to reduce thinking to just a set of bodily sensations or a bundle of reflexes, because I don't want to suggest that Chinese intellectuals argue against each other. They quarrel with each other because they are too emotional, because they're acting out of bodily intensities. So much so that they aren't really thinking. So what I'm trying to explore is how feeling and thinking are deeply intertwined. I mean, in Chinese literary history, there's this long-standing tradition about the question of reason-emotion nexus, or what's other known as the question of 情理之辩, right? Which goes, I believe, all the way back to the Neo-Confucianism of the Song Dynasty. And you also have this cult of qin, the cult of feeling, that has been studied by so many scholars with the question regard to Mingqing literature. So I think the point coming from the Chinese tradition is not to determine which one overpowers the other, whether emotion dictates thinking or whether thinking governs emotion. Rather, what I'm trying to combine the Western affect theory and the Chinese indigenous tradition of 情理之辩 is that we should think about how emotion and feeling, how emotion and reason intersect, how they work together, and how that intersection shapes intellectual discourse of the post-Mao period. So I think it would be great if I can give you an example, because we are just talking about abstract theories. So in some of the cases that I explore, emotion is treated as part of ethical reasoning. So you have this kind of equation between emotion and ethical reasoning. For example, there was a big and influential debate in the 1980s about the burden of guilt, the question of 罪感文化. I mean, essentially, intellectuals of that time was arguing, was debating issues such as, should everyone be held accountable for the crimes of the Red Guards? So when people are talking about the question of guilt, the question of 罪 here, guilt obviously isn't just a feeling or bodily sensation. It is seen as an essential part of liberal reasoning. So reformist intellectuals argue that in order to come to terms with the past, a guilty conscience is necessary for a kind of transitional justice they envisions. So that's one case here where you have this equation between emotion and reason. But in terms of other cases, such as nationalism, we just talked about, nationalism is all about like how different agents, they try to manipulate, they try to take on those quirky emotions. So I would be really reluctant to summarize or to theorize a one-way street or to find out a causality here. And I think that my job in this book is less ambitious. It just tries to carefully describe, carefully delineate the ways in which qin and li, emotion and reason, how they intersect on a case-by-case basis.
Wow, this is not say a humble book. This is actually a very ambitious book, because you're trying to really chart out a new trajectory of the dialogue or dialectic between Qing and Li, right, over hundreds of years in Chinese history, both modern times and the pre-modern times. But for me, however, of all the 5 case studies you presented in the book, one chapter that struck me as most intriguing And probably to a certain extent, it also speaks to the intricacy of Qing versus Li, as you discussed just now, is a chapter on Liu Xiaofeng. I believe for most of our audience here, Liu Xiaofeng probably is a known name, but probably people like us don't quite understand why he was so important from 1990s even to date. And you devote a whole chapter to the case of Liu Xiaofeng, his dedication to Christianity on the one hand, and also his adherence to traditional Confucianism on the other hand, and of course, above all, ultra-conservative. Could you say a few words about Liu Xiaofeng in light of what you mentioned about Qing and Li just now?
Sure. Well, I hope Professor Liu is not listening right now. We know Professor Liu Xiaofeng is regarded as one of the major advocates of Leo Strauss in the Chinese-speaking world, not just for this kind of Straussian neoconservative agenda, but also for his distinct method of reading old books. I mean, Leo Strauss had a rather peculiar way of reading ancient classical books dating back to Greco-Roman antiquity. And his motto, I believe, was that when you are trying to approach intellectual history, when you are trying to approach thinkers of the past, you should try to understand a thinker the way he understood himself. So, for example, when we are reading the Republic, Plato's Republic, the goal isn't simply to accuse Plato of laying the groundwork for philo-tyranny or totalitarianism, because back in Plato's time, these terms weren't invented. They're all modern definitions. Instead, Professor Leo Strauss believed that we should ask, how did Plato understand his own work? What was he trying to do? What was he trying to say when he said philosophers should rule the polis in his book? So that's actually essentially what I'm trying to do with Professor Liu. So trying to understand a thinker the way he understood himself. I mean, for those who have been drawn to Liu Xiaofeng's scholarship, you know that there have been so many accusations about his ideological shifts, about his ideological conversions, and even deconversions, I should say. But I'm trying to understand him, trying to unlearn all those accusations and trying to understand him on his own terms. I mean, did he really see himself as changing course so many times? And if we take his words seriously, can we trace a coherent thread running through his thinking? So that for me is the real question, and this is also why I devote a particular chapter, and I believe it is the longest chapter of all 5 chapters to unpack his thinking. And I think that my hypothesis that for Liu Xiaofeng, so you know that he traversed many grounds, first from Christianity and then into Confucianism and eventually into Maoism. But for him, I think those 3 doctrines, they are essentially the same thing at their core. What ties these doctrines, these political religious doctrines together is his search for the sublime. I mean, the vast, the ocean-like, almost religious feeling, the religious sentiment, the sense of agape that he believes is essential for grounding, for rebuilding, for reconstructing a strong normative moral order in the post-Mao, in the post-Marxist public sphere. So it's not so much for Liu Xiaofeng, I think it's not so much about specific doctrines as it is about the need for something transcendental. So I noticed that throughout his works, he repeatedly invoked one term, ultimate values, 终极价值, or ultimacy, trying to hold everything together. So I think the reason why he eventually converted to Maoism of some sort was because for him, Maoism or the Cultural Revolution was essentially a religious experience. And after its collapse, a new God was needed, whether that be the Christian God or the Confucian sage. So I was trying to use this Freudian term, oceanic feeling, or translate it into Chinese 海洋性感觉, to capture Liu Xiaofeng's search for the sublime and trying to make a rationale out of his conversion from culture Christian into a Maoist.
Okay. This is just a kind of anecdotal question. I mean, you graduated from National Sun Yat-sen University, Guangzhou, right, where Chen Yingque spent his last 20 years, right? That's the theme of your one chapter. I mean, has Liu Xiaophong taught at the National 𝘚𝘦𝘯𝘶 University for a while too?
Yeah, I think he taught at 𝘚𝘦𝘯𝘶 University for a long time, and
Yeah.
he even established a liberal arts, a Straussian kind of liberal arts college there before he found a new job at Renmin University.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's a very intriguing, right? This is a great university, right? Which is sort of experienced over a span of a half a century, right? Two kinds of intellectual figures in kind of imaginary dialogue, Chen Yingzheng on the one hand, and Liu Xiaophong and his ultra-Maoism on the other. Back to where I wanted to find out your response to some of the queries about the fact, actually, that your book has concentrated more upon the emotional politics of the elite writers, intellectuals, and literati in general. And where are the people, right? When we are talking about either emotion politics or affect studies, people like to talk about the people. So how would you like to answer such a kind of query?
Well, well, I would say that that's almost like an original theme for any intellectual historians. I mean, you have this notion of intellectual historian as those who study high realm of ideas and who doesn't give a damn about the people. And as a matter of fact, many years ago, I remember when I was a kind of timid young graduate student presenting my paper on left-wing melancholia for the first time at AAS, I was hit with exactly the same question. So you write about all these melancholic elite writers, but what about the people? I mean, what about the workers, the peasants, and the underprivileged people? Who speaks for them? And I have been wrestling with that question since then. And I think that it suddenly occurs to me that Zhu Xueqin actually wrote a really fascinating article back in the early 1990s called 思想史上的失踪者. So those who disappeared from intellectual history. So in that article, he was reflecting on his time as a Shandong youth working in a factory in the 1980s, back in the 1980s. In the 1980s, all of these people, these intellectuals, they have to merge with people and they work in a kind of labor manual work. And at that time, the New Enlightenment movement had just begun as a national craze, has just begun as a national movement. And so Zhu Xueqin, in that article, he described how ordinary workers, just factory workers, after 4 days labor, they would gather in a study room. They would gather in the evening for reading groups, for Marxist reading groups, and debating those big philosophical questions like Marxist humanism, the economic manuscript of 1944. But then we see when later scholars, they wrote about that period, wrote about the New Enlightenment movement. It's all about those big names like Wang, 𝘗𝘢𝘯𝘪𝘯𝘗𝘠, 𝘚𝘦𝘯𝘵𝑑𝑎o, and so on and so forth. But those who had actually participated in the movement simply vanished, simply disappeared from the historical record. And I think that any intellectual historians, any literary scholars must grapple with this sense of original sin, a critical awareness of this problem in representation. But I would say that most of the writers and thinkers that I have discussed here, be they a leftist thinker or right-wing thinker or nationalist, to some extent, they are the cultural elite of their generation. But many of these intellectuals were actually deeply invested in the question of how to represent the people. I mean, take Chen Yingzheng, the radical Marxist writer coming from the tradition of Taiwanese left, for example. I mean, Chen Yingzheng wasn't just theorizing left-wing melancholia from an ivy tower. He was an activist. He was jailed 7 years, and he tried to run a left-wing newspaper called 𝘚𝘦𝘯𝘶𝘣𝘓 in the 1980s. So when these figures might not be of the people in the strict sense, my book tried to show the extent to which their struggles over representation are in themselves meaningful in a certain way to make intellectual history more open and more democratic. Oh, and I forgot to mention that I did devote a whole chapter not to the people themselves directly, but to those who pretend or to those who claim to speak for them. You know, the last chapter, the authors of China Can Say No, right? Though these are the ones who claim, who insist that they speak for the 99%, and they want to establish that kind of direct, populist, unfiltered connection with the masses.
That's fun, all right. Okay, I just want to say that this is really a very rich book, which covers immense terrain of genres, right? We can call it a book on intellectual history, on political thought, on emotion and affect, and also on literature. Why literature? I understand that your major was literature, and why you wanted to bring literature to bear upon, say, inquiries which largely concern the public sphere of the political dynamics and the historical mutations.
Yeah, I think I'm drawn to the question of literature because essentially I'm really attracted to the tradition of critical biography. I mean, how do you enter the life of the mind? How do we reconstruct the life world of intellectuals? And I think this is where literature comes in handy. And I know that this might sound a little bit against the current or even old-fashioned, as we live in the age of digital humanities, right, where everyone wants to possess a massive amount of data and examples to draw on. But at least for me personally, I mean, for me, the urge to understand ideas as lived, as practiced, especially as embodied by particular individuals, by particular intellectual figures, has only grown stronger, even in our post-human age. That is why I take inspiration from those literary scholars like Chen-Ying-Ke, who argue that you should have this method of emphatic understanding. You should have 了解之同情. You should try to stand in the same realm as thinkers of the past and use your literary and historical imagination to see the world through their eyes. And I think that literature is a crucial lens to approach their life world, to enter their inner lives, to unpack their emotion in a certain way.
And I understand that your literature is certainly not limited merely to the standard or standardized genres, but you really want to cover a lot of, say, documents, archives, writings, treatises across, say, intellectual and political history, right? For me, actually, also I'm curious about your personal take in terms of emotion politics. I understand that Tu Hang, you're very young. You were born after 1990, right? 90后. And when you were a baby, right, those people you talked about, Liu Xiaofeng, so they were already big figures on the political or intellectual stage in post-1989 China. How did you come to terms with this fact that you were coming in a little late, right? After all this big drama, big events being staged in China throughout the Maoist and the post-Maoist days. So what is your personal emotional responses to the questions you raised and the discoveries that you made?
Well, that is really a good question. Well, I don't think that I have a good answer to that. All I can say is that I really like dramatic characters or melodramatic figures. I mean, essentially, this book is not a comprehensive survey of emotional politics in contemporary China. I mean, plenty of scholars have done that in an admirable way, and I don't think that I can do better. Instead, I think that this is one of the problems of this book, is that I'm almost dominated or influenced by my own aesthetic taste. I mean, I'm particularly drawn to those distinctive vinegars, those self-styled intellectuals like Li Zheho, who dare to somehow fuse Kant with Marx and later merge it with Confucian ethics of emotions, or ideological converts like Liu Xiaofeng we've just talked about, who traveled so long way from Christianity to Maoism. And then there's this really truly unexpected encounters like Wang Yi and Chen Yingzhen quarreling over the issue of Maoism, and they are trying to build in a dialogue across the Taiwan Strait. So my case is that my hope is that these individual cases might serve as a reference point, a kind of barometer of collective aspirations. for us to understand, for us to approach contemporary Chinese and Sinophone intellectual dynamics. Yeah.
And of the 5 chapters, what is your favorite chapter? This is again kind of more personal question. I mean, 5 extremely stimulating case studies, and any particular topic or chapter that you really wanted to recommend to our audience? Say you must read this, right? If you have only so much time, you must read this and that chapter.
Yeah, I would actually recommend my readers to start from the last chapter on popular nationalism.
Okay, China Can Say No chapter.
Yeah, that's
fun.
easily my favorite pick. Yeah, I mean, the figures in my other chapters, they are way too serious to a certain way. I mean, it's all about the grand narrative of revolution and enlightenment. I mean, sometimes I feel that they are so polite and they are so well-mannered, you know, but when I read about the writings of those grassroots intellectuals, you know, the Say No authors, they have that swagger, they have that cynical realism, they have this over-the-top confidence, or even sometimes tongue-in-cheek sarcasm. And sometimes they're just downright clownish. I mean, these are cynics, these are charlatans, these are hypocrites, these are quacks. And even though you don't take them seriously, that ineloquence, that kind of, I mean, what we call truthful hyperbole these days, all of them making them a really a lot more fun, I would say, to write about and to read about.
Good. So what are you working on now? Actually, we have a couple of members from our audience raising questions. I believe my question is a sort of kind of a extension of our first guest's question. So what is the current scene in terms of the emotional landscape in China? And are you still working on the topic? Or anyway, what are you working on now? I mean, after Sentimental Republic?
Yeah, well, you know how this goes. I mean, every second project is a natural extension of the first one. And I have to say that after spending way too long writing this book, took me 8 or 10 years, especially after living through this pandemic and watching all the shit that followed. I mean, I don't know. I feel I've grown increasingly cynical about Chinese intellectual politics, or even intellectual politics in general. So much so that my new project will actually be about cynicism, about 全儒主义 in modern Chinese history. I mean, we all have this sense, we all have this ominous feeling that we now live in the age of cynicism, when all lofty ideas from revolution and enlightenment are now viewed with some sort of suspicion, some sort of doubt, right? So the real question for me at this moment is cynicism purely negative? I mean, how does it work? And especially what can it promise and what it can deliver? So in this new book project, I try to think of cynicism not just a conformist mentality, but something more subtle, more fluid, like a kind of, micro-resistance, or the art of not being governed, or an attitude of cheeky, mischievous insubordination in dark times. So my current writing plan is to study the making of cynical reason in 20th century China. And I'm trying to do it through the lens of satirical literature, do it through the lens of 讽刺文学, basically everything from Lu Xun to Wang Xiaobo. So I started with Lu Xun because Lu Xun was the one who followed his teacher Zhang Taiyan and translated the English cynic as 全儒, so literally dog-like confusions or dog confusion, and first brought the term from Japan into the Chinese context. And then there's Wang Xiaobo, 1990s, notorious for his style of cynical realism, or what literary historians call 玩世现实主义. And Wang Xiaobo has that playfulness, that dark humor, and especially his kind of cheeky defiance against the political orthodox of his time. So that's the spirit that I'm trying to grapple with, that I'm trying to capture it in my second book project.
In your new book project, this is also another dimension of emotion politics, right? Cynicism. Are you going to talk about Chairman Mao? Is Chairman Mao a cynic? Let me just ask this kind of blunt question. You don't have to answer it, but I'm just curious about your thought about this whole say, spectrum of cynical leaders and writers and intellectuals throughout 20th century?
I think I would talk about the representation, the cultural representation, the literary representation of Chairman Mao in the reform period. I mean, I would be focusing on the literary representation of, for example, his body magic, how his embalmed corpse, how his embalmed body became a site of fascinating religious fantasies, all sorts of, you have science fiction writers like Liu Xun talking about Mao. So I will try to approach that topic through the lens of literary representation.
Okay. All right, we have questions from the audience. Let me just, I sort of touch upon the first question, so I'll skip it. The second question raised by Alice Zheng, I think. Thank you, Professor Tu and Professor Wang, for your conversation. May I ask Professor Tu, you lay out the politics of emotion, but you mentioned affect and Deleuze as well. Would you mind further clarifying how are you differentiating between your use of emotion and affect? I thought you have answered that, but probably you won't mind just reiterating what you mentioned, or just trying to give your answer in a different way. Emotion versus affect.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So in my book, I invoke Anna Parkinson's account. He was trying to make a distinction between affect and emotion. So when we think about emotion, we're thinking about the social regulation of emotion, especially emotion in a normative social and political context. So when we talk about the question of guilt, how guilt might be rechanneled into a sort of transitional justice, then we are talking about emotion. But then we are talking about bodily sensations, this kind of autonomous forces that governs our thinking and governs our actions, such as nationalist resentment. Then we are working within the realm of affect. So that's basically how I try to make a distinction between affect and emotion.
Okay, we have many great scholars actually online listening to our conversation today. And here we have Professor 𝘕𝘠𝘮, who also raised a question. Okay, actually, you got more and more audience coming up with new questions, but in the interest of time, maybe I would just have you answer 𝘕𝘠𝘮's question. She actually used cases such as Wang Meng and Wolfgang Becker's film, which were part of your PowerPoint presentation. But primarily, her question has to do with how does essential lived experience fit into your study of emotion as it is related to intellectuals as they feel the Mao's past. So the essential lived experience, that part of this emotion politics, how would you address that aspect in your study?
Yeah, thank you, Wendy, for this wonderful question. So when I was trying to address the question of left-wing melancholia, my hope is that I could try to, or I could help to depathologize melancholy as a kind of political pathology or kind of political passivity. I mean, you know, in the tradition of Western Marxism, or even in the tradition of Chinese socialism, when we think about feelings like melancholia, like aesthetics of melancholy, were mainly associated with pathos, with defeat, with the kind of inaction that will lead the left toward destruction or lead into despair. But then after 1989, with this global turn to the melancholic dimension of global Marxism, with the disorientation of the global left, is it possible to think about melancholy not simply as a syndrome of defeat, but more of a kind of tension or a kind of dialectic between thinking and action? So here I'm invoking the Arendtian distinction between vita activa and vita contemplativa. I think a lot of left-wing writers, they felt melancholic because they are kind of caught between the urge, the will to fight, the will to actualize their revolutionary cause, and that kind of reflexive, that contemplative stance that thwarted them from devoting fully, full-heartedly into the revolutionary cause. So I did touch upon, I don't think that I mentioned Jiang Wen's film, but I talk about a much later one, �𝘠𝘭𝘵's 𝘊𝘭, and I think that in a sort of way talk about these sensual bodily sensations related to that kind of red nostalgia.
Okay, very good. We actually are running short of time, but I want to end our conversation with a quick reference to Professor Haipeng's question for you, Tu Hang. Basically, he asked, in your judgment, has populist nationalism captured the Chinese state today? Speaking of today, is the notion of popular sovereignty a point of convergence between the grassroots underdogs and intellectual elites in a time when populist nationalism is on the rise across the globe? So basically, a general question about popular nationalism in relation to your understanding of emotion politics. So we probably have to make this very brief, but please try your best to answer. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. So I'm not trying to get into debate of populism here, but based on my limited understanding of populism, scholars of populism argue that you have populism only in a democratic country. So in an authoritarian setting, populism operates much differently than in a context like American or Western Europe. So I think Professor Tang Wenfang has a book called Authoritarian Populism, where he was linking populism to that tradition of mass line policy, 群众 Lu Xun. So it was populism, but on the other hand, co-opted by the state. So I think that lens of analysis might be better answer your question.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Tu Hang. I really admire your erudition and eloquence. In 1 hour, we have covered so many grounds. And of course, I have read the book, and personally, I highly recommend that if you happen to be interested in the goings on in contemporary Chinese, say, political and historical and literary dynamics, this is a book you may want to check out and have a good read. We have used up of our time. So ladies and gentlemen online, thank you very much for joining us wherever you are. And of course, my biggest thanks go to Tu Hang for your wonderful contribution to the field. Thank you very much. I look forward to more dialogue with you in the future. And thank you very much, everybody, wherever you are. Have a wonderful day or a wonderful night. Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yeah.